What if everything you thought you knew about Eve's origin was based on a mistranslation? Could a single Hebrew word, misunderstood for centuries, hold the key to rewriting spiritual history? This revelation doesn't just challenge a myth, it reawakens a sacred truth long buried beneath doctrine. For centuries, we were taught that Eve was born from Adam's rib, a story repeated so often it became almost unquestionable, a dogma disguised as metaphor. But what if I told you that this was never in the Bible? That the original Hebrew text doesn't mention a rib, but something far deeper, far more symbolic. And perhaps this explains why so many ancient traditions saw the feminine as a perfect mirror of the divine. The Hebrew word used in Genesis is not raya. And this small detail, neglected for centuries, not only changes the entire interpretation of the creation myth, but also topples entire pillars of doctrine, belief, and spiritual hierarchy. It's as if by mistranslating a single word, we sealed the fate of half of humanity. The error, or was it a choice to translate Sela as rib, was not just linguistic. It was theological. It was political. It was symbolic. Because what's at stake here is not just the origin of woman, but the origin of the division between masculine and feminine, spirit and flesh, creator and creature. And what we're about to reveal in this video might shake the very foundations of Western spirituality. Along this journey, we'll open the black box of biblical language. We'll draw from sources that range from the oldest Hebrew manuscripts to Gnostic texts, including Kabbalistic interpretations and insights from philosophers like Foe of Alexandria and mystics like Hildegard of Bingen. But above all, we'll restore the hidden meaning of what may have been the first mistranslation with planetary consequences. Prepare to see Genesis with new eyes, because what was taken from Adam may not have been a bone. It may have been half of his own soul. In the underground chambers of language, there are words that act as keys, words that seem simple, but when misinterpreted build entire worlds on fragile foundations. Sela is one of those words. In the book of Genesis 2:21, the traditional narrative presents us with an image too familiar to question. God causes a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, takes one of his ribs, and transforms it into a woman. This scene, repeated, dramatized, and canonized for centuries, has shaped not only the religious imagination of the West, but also the symbolic structure of the relationship between masculine and feminine for much of humanity. But in the original Hebrew, there is no rib, no bone, there is tela. And understanding what this word truly means is like finding a crack in an ancient wall, an opening through which we can glimpse a story completely different from the one we've been told. The root of the word Sela appears over 40 times in the Torah, with a surprisingly consistent usage, never as a rib. In texts describing sacred constructions like the tabernacle and Solomon's temple, Sela is used to refer to structural sides, the sides of the ark, walls, or staircases. A good example is Exodus 26, where the word describes the side panels of the sanctuary. In none of these cases did translators choose rib, only in Genesis 2. Why? That question has haunted scholars, linguists, and theologians for centuries. And the answer lies not just in grammar, but in theology, politics, and above all, in the symbolism that underpins patriarchal structures of the Western world. Translating Sela as rib is more than a technical error. It is a symbolic mutilation. Heb theologian Klaus Fiestermann warned that the isolated use of a translation for a polemic term should always raise hermeneutic suspicion. In other words, when a word like tela is translated radically differently in only one place in the Bible, and precisely in the most sensitive passage in terms of gender and spiritual hierarchy, something more than grammar is at play. If we go back to the context in which the Septuagint was translated, the 3rd century BCE, we find a Hellenized society that already viewed the feminine with ontological suspicion. Plato, though he spoke of the soul as androgynous, placed the masculine as the seat of reason and the feminine as the domain of desire and illusion. Aristotle was more direct. For him, woman was an incomplete man. In this atmosphere, the translators of the Septuagint, encountering the word Sela, chose plura, pleva, a Greek term that can mean both side and rib. An ambiguous choice that when later translated into Latin in St. Jerome's Vulgate became costa, the bone, the lesser, the fragment. And thus Eve ceased to be the other face of the human being and became a piece, an accessory, a part of man, not his counterpart. Kabbalah, when interpreting Genesis, never understood Sela as Rylus. It refers to the separation of the two columns of being, the right and the left, the giving and the receiving, the active and the receptive, expressions of spiritual polarity, not anatomy. The Zohar, a foundational text of Jewish mysticism, states that the original being was complete and that God revealed what was already hidden within him. That revelation is not a removal, but a differentiation, and that is crucial. In initiatory traditions, the act of creation is never one of amputation, but of unfolding. Just as the one manifests as two without fragmenting, the original human unfolds into masculine and feminine as expressions of divine polarity in the world. What Genesis suggests, therefore, is not that woman was made from a bone, but that the human being was bifurcated, and that this bifurcation is in itself the beginning of the spiritual journey. The 19th century Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch wrote something that anticipates this esoteric interpretation with remarkable precision. The word sa refers to one half of a symmetrical structure. Therefore, woman was not made from a lower part of man, but from a side equal and opposite to form, together with the other side, a harmonious whole. This harmonious whole is what Kabbalah would call parchim configurations of energy that, when balanced, reflect divine light. Eve, therefore, is not a rib. She is the revelation of the sacred symmetry of being. When we read Genesis in this light, it ceases to be a primitive tale about human origins and becomes a coded manual of spiritual cosmology. The first human was not a man, but a complete being. The creation of Eve is the creation of otherness. And what was taken from Adam was not a bone. It was an entire principle. The mistranslation of Tella disrupts this balance, and in doing so, it turns woman from a mirror into a shadow, from a soul into a rib, from a co-creator into a consequence. And this shift made in a single line of text echoed like a seismic wave through the collective unconscious for millennia. The philosopher Jacques Derrida, when speaking of sacred language, said that every translation is also a betrayal. The choice of the word rib betrays not only the original text, but the very spirit of the myth. Perhaps in finally understanding what Sela is, we are not merely correcting a translation. We are unearthing a forgotten truth that before the division there was unity, and that every true spiritual quest is at its core a longing to return to what was never truly separated, only hidden. Before masculine and feminine, before even the distinction between spirit and matter, there was only unity. This idea, so foreign to the modern mind that analyzes everything in parts, was well understood by ancient initiatory traditions. The primordial being, according to these traditions, was neither man nor woman, but a living, pulsating totality that carried within itself all opposites still undivided. The Bible, when read in Hebrew and through the lens of esoteric tradition, also contains this hidden secret. Genesis 1:27 already gives us clues. And God created high Adam in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. This verse is often ignored or rationalized superficially. But what it truly states is that the human being was created in the image of God, not as man nor as woman, but as both, or better yet, as neither in isolation. The image of God is fullness, not polarity. The word used here for human being is Adam, which, contrary to popular belief, does not mean Adam as a masculine name, but the being of the earth from the Hebrew Adama, fertile soil. It is a term that designates an archetype, not an individual, a state of being, not a biography. And this Adam was created with two powers within giving and receiving, solar and lunar. Active and receptive, a living manifestation of the one and two principle simultaneously. Later in Genesis chapter 2, we encounter the famous episode of the deep sleep in which God separates this androgynous being into two distinct aspects. It is in this moment that the feminine emerges, or rather becomes, visible. But as we saw in the previous chapter, this separation does not occur from a rib, but from a side C-cell cella, revealing that the original human possessed within a hidden side which was brought to light. This concept of primordial androgyny is not exclusive to the Judeo-Christian tradition. In ancient Greece, Plato described in the Symposium the myth of the androgen spherical complete beings with 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 faces looking in opposite directions, so powerful that the gods, fearing their strength, decided to cut them in half. Since then, each half has searched for its other part in a deep yearning for reunion. For Plato, love is born from this search for a return to lost wholeness. The echo of this story is striking in the very heart of Genesis. The separation does not occur as punishment, but as a creative act, a way to generate reflection, dialogue, and relationship. The world of the one is static. The world of the two allows for sight, touch, experience. Hebrew spirituality, even in its legalistic surface, retains the core of this teaching. Otherness is sacred. In the Kabbalistic tradition, this separation is described in terms of the parts, the faces or configurations of the divine. The Zohar teaches that the first human, called Adam Kadmon, was not made of flesh and bone, but was a luminous archetypal structure. Within him were 2 presences, Zir Anpin, the masculine aspect, and Nukiva, the feminine aspect. Their separation was not a fall, but a cosmic necessity. Only separated could they experience desire, absence, and ultimately union. Kabbalah explains that the union between these 2 halves, both in the heavens and in the human soul, is the source of true blessing. When Zir Anpin and Nukiva reunite, there is fertility, there is light, there is harmony in the universe. The microcosm and macrocosm intertwine. The same applies to our psyche. Inner healing only happens when we integrate what was separated, when the inner masculine and feminine cease to fight and begin to dance. Jung, deeply influenced by Gnostic and Eastern traditions, understood this when he developed the concepts of anima and animus. For him, every man carries within an unconscious feminine figurumum, and every woman carries an unconscious masculine figure animus. The process of individuation, the realization of the totality of being, only occurs when these aspects are recognized, integrated, and harmonized. The original separation described in Genesis is not therefore a mistake. It is the beginning of the path. The one divides in order to see itself, and only by seeing itself can it come to know itself. As the Persian mystic Rabia al-Basi said, "I was a point. God divided me in 2 so that I could see myself. In seeing myself, I saw God." But when separation is misunderstood, when it becomes hierarchy, domination, the supremacy of one pole over the other, it ceases to be a path and becomes an abyss. What was meant to be complementarity turns into subjugation. The feminine, which should be a mirror, becomes a shadow, and the masculine, without its reflection, loses its wholeness. The myth of the fall, which follows in the biblical narrative, is in its esoteric layer, the fall from sacred language into literal language, from symbolic union into doctrinal division. And the mistranslation of Sala, as we've seen, lies at the heart of this symbolic collapse. The Hindu tradition expresses this vividly in the symbol of Ardhanarishvara, the deity who is half man, half woman, a figure that shows us the sacred is neither masculine nor feminine, but the living tension between the two. Shiva and Shakti fused yet distinct, harmony and difference, unity and polarity. This is what Genesis read in its original language, and light seems to tell us that the human being is a bridge between opposites, that we were divided in order to love, and that the reunion with the other is at its core a reunion with ourselves. Eve was not made from a lower part. She was the externalization of Adam's hidden face. Masculine and feminine were not created to dominate one another, but to remember one another. And what they must remember is that before they were 2, they were 1. And that this one was not merely flesh, it was spirit, it was light, it was the Word. When the Hebrew text says that God built the woman from the Selah, the verb used is quite curious. Vivin derived from the root bh, which literally means to build, to construct, to architect. This word is rarely used for the creation of human beings. It is, however, used for the building of altars, temples, cities. With Eve, the Bible uses the verb of architecture, not the verb of sculpture, as with Adam. This alone reveals something subtle. Eve was not molded, she was constructed. This linguistic choice indicates planning, intention, structure. Eve is not created as a fix for Adam's loneliness, as is often suggested. She is a divine architectural work, as if the feminine presence were the external form of a mystery that had until then remained internal. Adam was the vessel, Eve the revelation. In the original text, Eve is called Chava Hava, a name that comes from the Hebrew root cha, which means life. The text says that Adam named her this for being the mother of all living. But the name Chava is also connected to an ancient Aramaic term meaning to manifest, to declare, to reveal. In other words, Eve is the one who gives life, but also the one who gives form to what was previously hidden. This idea echoes powerfully in the Kabbalistic tradition. According to the Zohar, Eve is the revealed aspect of Adam's soul, not a companion in the earthly sense, but the visible expression of the invisible, the external face of divine interiority. The feminine in this understanding is what gives body to spirit, form to breath, flesh to light. Rabbi Moshe Cordova, one of the great figures of 16th century Kabbalah, wrote that the feminine is the vessel that contains the light, not because it is inferior, but because it is necessary. Without form, light disperses. Without a container, creation dissolves. Eve represents this sacred containment. She is the envelope of revelation. That is why the feminine in mystical traditions has always been associated with the concept of Shekinah, the immanent divine presence. Shekinah is not just an attribute of God, she is God's very presence in the world, what descends from celestial abstraction and touches concrete reality. Eve, in this sense, is Shekinah personified, divine presence made flesh. In the esoteric symbolism of Genesis, Eve is not merely the first woman. She is the first incarnation of a universal principle, the visibility of the sacred. And this is precisely why, in so many cultures, the feminine is surrounded by veils, myths, and prohibitions. What is hidden is what shines the brightest and what most threatens structures of control. The demonization of the feminine, which would come later with the myth of temptation, and which will be the subject of the next chapter, begins here with the failure to understand Eve's revelatory nature. What should have been celebrated as a manifestation of the divine was reduced to an object, an accomplice to sin, a catalyst of the fall, a radical inversion of her true role. Eve the revealer became Eve the guilty. But in apocryphal texts, in occult traditions, the truth still pulses. In the Gospel of Philip, one of the Gnostic Gospels found in Nag Hammadi, we read, "The world cannot see the Lord without the woman is the force of revelation. How does spirit become flesh? Through the feminine." The same principle is expressed in the writings of Meister Eckhart, the 13th century Christian mystic, who said, "Every soul is feminine before God, for it is in the feminine that the divine reveals itself." In Tantric Hinduism, the divine is inconceivable without Shakti, the creative energy. Shiva without Shakti is only dormant consciousness. But when Shakti dances, the universe vibrates. Eve, therefore, is Shakti, the movement that awakens the static, the vibration that breaks the silence, the symbol that the sacred is not only above, but also here below among us. This truth was also preserved in the figure of Sophia, the divine wisdom of Gnostic texts. She is described as the one who fell from the higher world in an attempt to give form to light. Her fall is not punishment, but the consequence of revelation, and her redemption is the return to what she always was. Eve is at her core, the Hebrew Sophia, the face of the divine that dares to leave unity to become visible. And that is why she is life. Because what lives is what manifests, what breathes, what moves. In Depth Psychology, Jung and his disciple Tony Wolfe described the archetype of the feminine not only as mother or lover, but as mediator of mystery. Woman in her symbolic dimension is the pathway through which the unconscious becomes conscious. Eve, then, is not a character. She is a channel, a bridge between the invisible and the world. And all of this was erased with a breath, a line, a mistranslation. By turning Shava, the revealer of life, into the accomplice of error, we disfigured one of the most beautiful myths of revelation. But the symbol remains hidden, yes, but still shining. Because what Eve reveals is not just woman. It is the soul of the world.